Okay. So this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about democracy for what are probably obvious reasons for everybody, right? We've got a big election coming up. People are calling it the most important election in American history. There are comments being made about whether, democracy in the United States is dying, whether it's under threat. If you've been keeping track of events just this weekend, right? Just in Texas, it's been pretty scary, right? There was an effort to run one of Biden's buses off the road. Armed people were sort of causing trouble and surrounding the bus and driving very slowly. There was a bit of a collision between the two cars. Nobody got hurt, fortunately, but they ended up having to cancel an event. I've never heard of anything like that in the United States related to elections. I mean, that's just dramatic. In Harris County, Republicans were trying to get, I believe, 100,000 votes, maybe 120,000 votes thrown out because they had taken place at a drive-through voting center. They'd arranged the drive-through voting center because mail-in voting wasn't working very well. I saw just before we started, I noticed that it looks like that appeal has been rejected. It's not going to happen. Amusingly, like the first reason listed is they exceeded the word count, but so it's apparently it's almost kicked out on a technicality. But it's a threat we haven't seen before. In the broader picture, the Supreme Court has done a lot to gut the Voting Rights Act. That was something that was put in place that put pretty stringent requirements on states and really limited states' ability to to control their voter rolls for good reason, right? Because that power had been abused heavily in the past. Well, now that they have more control, we're seeing a lot more efforts um, to change who can vote, to alter who can vote, to affect those kinds of things. So those are just some of the things that I was thinking about. Oh, well, part of it too, right, is we now have a lot more awareness of the ways that our institutions are not necessarily democratic. The Senate, for example, right? I mean, the Senate itself operates on democratic principles for the most part, but each state sends two senators, which gives some states much less proportional representation, like their population gets a lot less representation than other states. So Wyoming sends two senators, California sends two senators, but their population isn't even remotely comparable, right, between those two states. The Electoral College is, of course, in sharp relief, and we're going to pay a lot of attention to that on Tuesday and into Wednesday. Um, so we're much more aware of our institutions and the way they're not necessarily democratic. Okay, so that gives us a chance to maybe start talking a bit about democracy and back up a little bit. To me, when we hit these times and sort of the news is piling on quickly, I always like to go back to history, right, and sort of think about the history of thought and where these ideas come from, and what people were thinking when they got put in place. It helps me think through sort of how we should behave now. It puts those ideas in context into previous struggles. Um, so I want to start talking a bit about John Locke, right? So John Locke was an English. He often gets called an English philosopher because that's what we know him for. He really worked as a doctor. He was an advisor to Lord Shaftesbury and a doctor and so on. He was a Puritan by religion, which put him in a religious minority in Britain. So he was very sensitive to the rights of religious minorities. So most of his thought is really designed to create political institutions that can respect the rights of um, rules are set up by the divine right of kings. That's the basic argument. So kings would make arguments that they are somehow descended ultimately from the apostles. Like they try to trace this line back between the king of England back to some apostle in Israel, which is always seems to me like borderline crazy. It's like, yeah, of course the kids just wandered clear over to England, and now they're going to be there. But the effort is to claim, right, that they've got the divine right, that they've been given from Jesus, from God to Jesus to them to be able to rule. Well, John Locke, if he's going to make room for religious minorities, he's got to overthrow that old idea. I think for most of us, that idea is pretty dead. So he was very successful in this respect because the thing that he replaced it with was this idea of the will of the people. Okay, so how Locke then wants to say government gets formed. It's not God says, bam, you should be the ruler. It's that a bunch of individuals are out there in the world, free and separate and independent. They run into what he calls inconveniences. That is, if there's a dispute between two neighbors, there's no way to resolve it. And they need a neutral judge between the two of them to be able to say, okay, here's the answer. Even if you lose that case, you're going to like having this judge around because you get a resolution, right? You get things solved. You don't have these conflicts just escalating and going on and on. So they come together to form first this entity that he calls the people. Now, the thing about the people is it is an abstract entity like a corporation or like a church or like a university or something like that. It's an abstract entity. It is not all of the individuals that are part of that. So I think because we use the word people, it gets confused. Every individual has to sign up for the people. So if we're going to become the people of the United States, every single individual agrees to become part of that people. And what it means is that you agree to let that group, let the people, resolve your conflicts. So if you have a dispute about, land with your neighbor, you have agreed to let the people resolve that conflict, to not do it yourself, right? You're not going to go out there and settle it. All right, so this abstract entity, the people, then creates the government. So there's a two-step process, right? People to government. The people can create the government in any form they choose. So it is not that the government has to be democratic that follows from this. The government can be anything that the people choose to create something useful. Of course, you're probably sensing some of the ambiguity in here, right? Since it's an abstract entity, it's a little difficult to ask it, right, what it thinks, how it can choose, right? There's a lot of vagaries in that area. I would point out it's not that different than the divine right of kings. God was less than specific about who he wanted to have rule as well. So there was a lot of room to argue there as well. So it's got that same sort of feature. So Locke says, all right, the people, right, will then set up a government, and the people will favor some more or less democratic institutions. Part, though, of his idea as well was the separation of powers. So what we would do is we'd set up a government with a set of checks and balances, so that if some individuals started using their public offices for themselves and not for the people, that the other branches of government could help check that tendency and rein that tendency in and try to focus back on the will of the people, that was going to be the goal. So democracy plays a role in helping to get to know what the will of the people is, but it's not the only thing that does that. So he did favor a judiciary that was not elected, so the Supreme Court, right, where that's completely not democratic. We don't vote for them, we don't approve them, right? The people don't actually personally get engaged in that way. Okay, so this is an interesting new structure, right? Democracy is an instrument here. It's useful. It's a way of trying to figure out what it is the people want. But it can, on his vision, be limited in lots of ways. Actually letting people vote could end up being oppressive. That doesn't necessarily represent the will of the people. Why not? This is where we come back to, say, the Bill of Rights. Right. If we let people vote, the majority of people could come back and say, we don't want the minority of people to be able to speak or to prohibit the other party, and there they go. So he doesn't want individuals to be oppressed. That's not the will of the abstract entity, the people, even if it is the will of the majority of individuals within that community. So he had an idea of rights that help restrain that. So this gets to me at something that's important about democracy. Democracy necessarily rests on rights that are not democratically decided. Right. We can't get together to vote on who should be allowed to vote. Because if we could just do that and just decide, right, oh, that group of people doesn't get to vote, well, then the majority could just kick out the minority, right, and just go through and weed them out. We have to have these fundamental rights. the right to vote, that protects democracy, but isn't, sort of generated from it, isn't subject to it. Okay. So I think that gives us an interesting sort of take and an interesting sort of humanist take that the United States adopted a lot of. We like to use that language about the will of the people. This idea that peoples control things has taken off, and we apply it around the world. You notice China will refer to itself as the People's Republic. I mean, this idea is everywhere at this point. The idea became more abstract in France with Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he adopts this idea of the people and acting on the will of the people. It becomes, well, he qualifies it in such a way that you can only really be a voter if you vote with the right kind of mindset. All right, so what's the problem here? If everybody gets together and just votes their own personal interest, right, the majority can exploit the minority. So if we think, about, I don't know, white people being a majority just because there's more of them, right? If they all vote their personal interest, that can end up being bad for Latinos, right? Because there's fewer of them. And things like that, right? So this is a classic problem. So Rousseau says no. To really be part of the people, you have to adopt the mindset that you don't know which individual you are. John Rawls articulates this as a veil of ignorance. So the idea would be when you are participating in government, you think of yourself as outside of the society, not as a person with a particular location, particular interests, things like that. You think that you're going to be born into that society at some point, right? And you could be in any position if you. So with that kind of view, you would try to structure every single position in society so it's as good as it could be, right? You wouldn't want there to be one group of people who are terribly exploited and another group of people who, take advantage of that and do really well, because you could end up being in the exploited group, right? So you want to try to bring it together. You want to try to level things out. You want to make every position as good as you could be. For him, only when you vote with that mindset are you really engaged in the people. If you vote with any other mindset, this is what's good for me, this is what's good for my party, this is what's good for my state, any other mindset, you're essentially cheating. Now, he didn't propose practically, we take your vote away, but you're essentially cheating. You're not being part of the people, you're just trying to steal from them. This idea of him, of what voters should be like and how voters should think, gets summarized wonderfully under the Three Musketeers slogan, all for one and one for all. I mean, that is the point of becoming part of the people, right? That you imagine yourself to be completely identified with every other individual in that group. You will use all of your power and energy to protect them, and they will do the same for you. So if you want to say, right, the other party loses, and therefore we're going to get rid of them, we're going to toss them out, we're going to do something like that, you're not really engaged in all for one and one for all, right? They're not part of us on that scheme. So here, democracy gets restrained a little more, right? It's an interesting way of thinking of yourself. It's not merely that everybody gets to vote. It's the way you think of yourself when you do vote, right? You have to think of yourself as part of this group of people and identify with those others in this group as though they are yourself, right? As though that could be you. That position that Rousseau thinks is important, that really matters. Now, on one hand, I think this is really attractive in some ways, right? It's much more sense of what is just and what is fair. And on the other hand, it's also a lot more hypothetical than what Jacques was there. John Locke could describe something that the American founders put in place almost exactly as he described it. Whereas Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Republic is so kind of vague that it's very difficult. It's been inspired France, but it's also been Cambodia and other places around the world to very different effects. Okay, so what does this highlight? I think to me this highlights a tension between democracy and justice. that purely democratic institutions aren't necessarily just in the way that they work. That we've got to restrict democracy in particular ways to try to generate a just result, right? To try to create something that is a just result. It emphasizes that participation in democracy depends a lot on the way that we think. It's not merely that you have a right to vote and that's the beginning and end of it. You need to think about yourself as connected to people in a certain way, in order for that to work, in order for democracy to connect. The last idea I want to bump up to and talk about a little bit is a contemporary idea argued for by Jason Brennan. He calls it an epistocracy. So this is an interesting modification of democracy. His first observation is that he puts it a little more gently than this, but I'm going to put it bluntly, that voters are notoriously stupid about what they vote for. So if you take the issue of immigration, which he looks at, a lot of people who oppose immigration, don't want there to be more immigration, want to see fewer people coming in from other countries, will say what they want to do is protect jobs and protect the economy. Now, if we go look to the social science, we find that actually immigration tends to be a small bonus for the economy. Economies tend to get slightly stronger with more immigration, because you have more people buying things and selling things. Like the immigrants come and they work, but then they also purchase things, and so then they're going to your businesses and so on. So we know that it's generally a small positive, but the people voting against it, right, in a way, like voting against the policy that would help them, would get them the result they're actually wanting. Okay, so how can we deal with that problem, that particular failure of voters to understand this? What he proposes with the epistocracy is that we have voters vote essentially on their values, like rank what is important to you in terms of economy, in terms of health, in terms of things like this. And then the candidates that win are the ones that would promote those values most effectively. So if we want to think about immigration, you would not say, I want to protect, or I'm against immigration because I want to protect jobs. You'd rank protecting jobs highly, right? And the policies that then would be adopted would be the ones that actually do that, even if they're policies that you would oppose. So the clever idea here is to insert X right in between voters and their policies. It's an interesting proposal because it suggests voting is about values fundamentally, right? We're not going to try to resolve that. We articulate our values when we vote. But you need an expert to implement those values. Right? I want to be protected from COVID-19. I want to see that that disease is handled well. Like, that's a priority for me. How to go about it? Well, I must admit, I'm not the best person to ask, right? At that point, then we defer. And that's when we hand it over to experts. So Brennan proposes that idea, an epistocracy, rather than really a democracy or something like that. All right. Well, I wanted to throw those ideas out there, just sort of get the conversation going for us to talk about democracy and its limits, right? Where we want to see it, where we don't, and maybe think a little bit about what we're actually seeing going on today in our world and in our election. And with that, I will stop it.